Anarchism, the State, and the Role of Education by Justin Mueller or Mueller, not sure how you pronounce the second name. Part 3. Anarchy, the State, and the Classroom. Usually developing in the interstices of dominant school systems, sustained anarchist schools have had an oft-troubled history of opposition and harassment from the powers that be. Often seen by states, even when not by the anarchist pedagogues themselves, as direct challenges to their organisational norms, social values and principles of authority, anarchist schools have faced bureaucratic reaction, censure and police repression. We will look at a few examples of anarchist schools, specifically the modern school of Francisco Ferrer and contemporary anarchist free schools and space, to see some of the general principles of anarchist education in practice. Escuela Moderna. The most prominent example of an overtly anarchist school would most likely be the Escuela Moderna, modern school, movement that originated in Spain, as developed, operated and expounded by Francisco Ferrer. Ferrer was an anarchist and an educator whose interest in experimental education grew alongside his disdain for the highly regimented and authoritarian school system of his home country. In the modern school of Ferrer, children were allowed greater freedom of individual inquiry and spontaneity, time for personal reflection in the school or in the gardens surrounding, and were not treated as lesser beings to be commanded by dogmatic authority as in the dominant Catholic schools of Ferrer's native Spain. Children, thought Ferrer, ought to be able to develop the potentiality of their whole being, not simply the instrumental, vocational or acontextually abstract, and thus were to be allowed to visit factories, museums, gardens and other community locales in order to learn through practice. Neither were they to be subjected to the nationalist messages of the state, impersonal and pedagogically inappropriate examinations, or the sexual segregation of the wider society. In his classic defence of these still seemingly radical practices, Ferrer declares that, having admitted in practice the co-education of boys and girls, of rich and poor, having, that is to say, started from the principle of solidarity and equality, we are not prepared to create new inequality. Hence, in the modern school, there will be no rewards and no punishments. There will be no examinations to puff up some children with the flattering title of excellent, to give others the vulgar title of good, and make others unhappy with a consciousness of incapacity and failure. While eschewing dogma, Ferrer did not believe, like A.S. Neal, in the possibility or desirability of teaching from a stance of political or ethical neutrality. After searching in vain for textbooks he felt were appropriately non-authoritarian for the school library, he eventually decided to install a printing press and commission works that addressed the injustices connected with patriotism, the horrors of war, and the iniquity of conquest, things he viewed as brute facts, obscured or hidden by the dogmas of the Catholic Church and the nationalism of the state. Ferrer saw all of this as fitting rightly within the anarchist tradition of prefiguration, the development of a new society in the shell of the old. As such, it shouldn't be a surprise that Spanish authorities reacted against this and closed down the school in 1906. What was a surprise to most, and the cause of an international outcry, was his subsequent execution resulting from bogus charges of instigating uprising following mass protests and general strikes in the wake of the Spanish war against Morocco. Free schools and free spaces. Informed in many ways by Ferrer, education philosopher Ivan Illich criticised the notion that a formal school is the proper place where education happens, arguing in defence of education as a lifelong process, rather than something that you only go through while young. Taken together, these ideas could suggest a notion of a school that is a socially embedded and democratic institution, freely available to all age groups, with a far more interactive and cooperative role between teachers, students and parents in designing curriculum, allocating resources and expanding education into experiences beyond the traditional schoolhouse and occasional field trip model. Especially important was Illich's insistence that sites of education remain open to the community, rather than rigidly institutionalized institutionalized in order to avoid monopolizations of informational or knowledge channels. This notion of open and free education fits well with Paul Goodman's belief that, in anarchist theory, the world revolution means the process by which the grip of authority is loosened so that the functions of life can regulate themselves without top-down direction and coordination. This notion seems to be demonstrated in the case of some recent anarchist free schools. Alan Antliff provides an inspiring account of a Toronto anarchist free school and its subsequent internet counterpart, Anarchist U. These schools were and are non-profit, voluntarily operated and open attendance schools run along anarchist organisational lines. Within them, classes are freely proposed and freely joined by anyone interested on any number of topics. Antliff describes the different attitude of participants. Once education was made free and grading and other assorted punitive measures, degree denial, were set aside, people could learn without competing with one another or striving to satisfy authority figures in their midst. Such successful, open and community-embedded experiments can provide for a cornucopia of educational diversity and stimulate interests beyond traditional subjects, while ensuring ready, open access to knowledge for those who desire it. Anarchist schools and educational spaces have thus emphasised the free-flowing nature of learning and abhorred intellectual regimentation, viewing this as the death knell of independent thought. This notion of how a school can operate certainly appears radical when compared to the operation of contemporary public schools or universities. Both of the latter are usually managed in a top-down manner with little direct control over the meaningful operations of the institutions by teachers, students or parents, at least in the case of public schools. Academic departments within universities can have some degree of internal self-management, although this does not extend equally to graduate students, adjunct instructors, or other largely contingent university education workers who have little academic freedom or job security. The state and the classroom. To quote John D. Rockefeller, "In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our moulding hands. The present education conventions of intellectual and character education fade from their minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk." The repression and marginalisation experienced by many anarchist schools and experiments, among other obstacles, has historically made the operation of truly independent anarchist educational programmes difficult. The implementation of anarchist educational and political ideals within the dominant state-run public school systems has had its own set of difficulties. The variety of critiques developed in response to this difficulty are diverse, but they are all rooted in the notion that various forms of state-run school organisation, pedagogy and practices violate the values and methods anarchists believe to be necessary to cultivate free and critical minds and defend solidaristic and egalitarian social relations. A principal critique from anarchist educators has been that the authority relations between students and teachers, teachers and administrators, and between schools and the state are part of a formidable hierarchy that seeks to instill and reproduce amenable attitudes towards institutional authorities and deference towards authority as such. Rather than develop educational systems that gravitate around the needs of the individual child, children are moulded to the goals and expectations of the state educational system. In a capitalist system, this manifests as publicly funded apprentice training for corporations, government, and the reproduction of the educational system itself, as well as adjusting students to their problems with authority. For Goodman, the bell-ringing, time-accounting and hierarchical authority and disciplinary system of state schools function as a form of behavioural operant conditioning, developing obedience rather than spontaneity or initiative. Voltairine de Cleyre, an American anarchist and teacher, criticised the school systems at the end of the 19th century for their authoritarian operations and the effect they had upon their unfortunate students. She decried how children were forced to sit silently and absolutely still for hours on end, while being taught material that had little relevance to their own lives and interests, and usually sought to expound the virtues of the dominant political order through the guise of a benign claim to truth. The effect of this, she noted, was to put an iron mould upon the will of youth, destroying all spontaneity and freedom of expression. Her most effective description of the absurdity of this system is encapsulated in a poignant, if lengthy, as was her style, metaphor. Any gardener who should attempt to raise healthy, beautiful and fruitful plants by outraging all these plants' instinctive wants and searchings would meet as his reward sickly plants, ugly plants, sterile plants, dead plants. He will not do it. He will watch very carefully to see whether they like much sunlight or considerable shade, whether they thrive on much water or get drowned in it. The plant itself indicates to him when he is doing the right thing. If he finds the plant revolts against his experiments, he will desist at once and try something else. If he finds it thrives, he will emphasize the particular treatment so long as it seems beneficial. But what he will surely not do will be to prepare a certain area of ground, all just alike, with equal chances of sun and amount of moisture in every part, and then plant everything together without discrimination, mighty close together, saying beforehand, if plants don't want to thrive on this, they ought to want to, and if they're stubborn about it, they must be made to. Anarchist educators would agree then with critical pedagogues in the judgment that the implementation of standardized testing regimes, a cornerstone of current policies like No Child Left Behind, renders pedagogical experimentation and potential challenges to this arrangement very difficult, even when a cantankerous or brave educator, anarchist or otherwise, does have the desire. Standardized tests are seen in Fordist fashion as imposing uniform performance expectations and methods upon students who have different learning styles, individual needs, and who may be at different places in their personal intellectual development. Further, rather than encouraging a curriculum oriented towards the development of critical analytical skills or fulfilling personal curiosity, standardized tests encourage a shallow, bulimic approach to learning. This entails the rote consumption and regurgitation of contextually isolated facts and figures on command, with high performance on a test seen as an end in itself, and synonymous with having learned something. On top of it all, standardized tests serve as gatekeepers of educational achievement, threatening failure and halting further learning until adequacy is demonstrated. In the face of this sort of education, some radical pedagogues have looked for inspirational educational alternatives in the ancient Athenian educational system and principles of paideia. The value of this system does have limits, given, among other things, the political limitations and prejudices of ancient Athens, and I would agree with that sentiment as Libertarian Socialist rants. However, in comparing broadly libertarian educational principles to the broad, civic-minded self-improvement goals of the ancient Athenian educational system of paideia, we can find a useful epochal counterpart to relate to the modern state. The correlate ideal educational system of the modern state can, then, be understood as a combination of disciplinary market instrumentalism and agoge, the ancient Spartan disciplinary regimen. In the agoge regimen, youth, solely males then, were trained to value loyalty to the state over the self, military discipline, conformity, and competition among peers for the purposes of establishing dominance. In creating more space within the modern educational system for alternatives to this disciplinarian and regimented pedagogy, alternatives like paideia or other models of inspiration could certainly provide a welcome reprieve and protect pockets of spheres of free action, even if they are ephemeral. In comparing the structures and functional values of state schools in the United States with previous examples of anarchist schooling, and after elaborating on the values, organizational principles, and understanding of human nature within anarchist thought, I hope that the differences in values instilled and desirable types of persons developed are made starkly apparent. Many of the critiques of state school systems offered by anarchist educators are over a century old, yet, unfortunately, sound incredibly contemporary. Conclusions. Ultimately, I hope to have demonstrated that understanding the relationship between anarchism and education is a worthwhile project. While sharing many commonalities with other radical traditions, I believe that anarchist theory provides an identifiably distinct perspective for understanding and approaching education as a political, prefigurative, and transformative encounter, regardless of one's politics. I hope to have also demonstrated the importance of education for anarchism as a political theory, an emancipatory personal and social project. The implications of this appreciation for education and the importance of early prefigurative value contestation and construction are twofold, however. Gustav Landauer best summarized this conceptual problematic in this way. The state is not something which can be destroyed by a revolution, but is a condition, a certain relationship between human beings, a mode of human behaviour. We destroy it by contracting other behaviour, by behaving differently. Understanding oppressive institutions as not things to be destroyed, but relationships to remake and ideas to replace is a double-edged sword. It is frustrating in that it disperses the sites of critical social contestation against oppressive institutions and ideas to, literally, the minds of every individual, though this does not preclude traditional externalized social struggles for greater equity and liberty. It is encouraging, though, in that it reveals their non-monolithic and mutable nature. Taking advantage of an anarchist approach to education, then, could, in terms of pedagogy and praxis, open up greater possibilities for imagining and cultivating alternative social relationships in the minds of those who would live them.